The rain had not stopped for 11 days. In the forgotten valley town of Millhaven, that kind of rain was not unusual in late October, but this year it felt personal. It came in sideways sheets that turned the dirt roads to rivers of red mud, battered the aluminum rooftops until the sound became a kind of madness, and settled into the bones of every living thing with a cold that had nothing to do with temperature. The kind of cold that came from inside. Arthur Briggs had learned to live inside that cold. At 68, with 2 tours of Vietnam tucked behind his eyes like splinters he could never fully dig out, he had mastered the art of existing without truly living. His farm sat at the eastern edge of town, separated from its nearest neighbor by a quarter-mile of overgrown pasture, a fact that suited him perfectly. He did not want neighbors. He did not want conversation. He did not want the particular look that people gave a man who flinched at car backfires and sometimes sat on his porch at 3 in the morning, rifle across his knees, staring at nothing. What he had was Lily. 7 years old, with her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn chin, Lily Briggs had not spoken a single word in 14 months. Not since the night of the accident on Route 9, when a drunk driver had crossed the center line and taken both of her parents in an instant, leaving her buckled into the back seat to sit in the wreckage for 2 hours before anyone found her. The paramedics had said she was physically uninjured. They had used that word carefully, with the particular precision of people who know exactly what they are and are not saying. She ate. She slept. She drew pictures of dogs and horses and birds in flight. She followed Arthur around the farm like a small, grave shadow, helping him scatter feed and mend fences with a seriousness that broke his heart every single morning. But she did not speak. The therapist in Millhaven, a well-meaning woman named Dr. Cortez who smelled of lavender and dispensed optimism in measured doses, called it trauma-induced selective mutism and assured Arthur that children often recovered in their own time. Arthur nodded and drove home and sat with his granddaughter in silence. 2 people stranded on the same island, neither one able to build the bridge. The only person making noise in Arthur's life these days was his nephew Kevin. Kevin Marsh was 35 years old, cheerful in the manner of a man who has never once questioned his own appetites, and he had been calling Arthur with increasing frequency over the past 3 months. The calls always began the same way. "Uncle Art, I've been thinking about your situation," and ended with some variation of the suggestion that Arthur was too old to run the farm alone, that Lily needed a more stable environment, and that a fair sale price could be arranged with very little trouble. Kevin's voice, on these calls, had the smooth, boneless quality of a man rehearsing lines he had practiced in a mirror. Arthur had not answered the last 4 calls. He understood, in the slow, certain way that old soldiers understand threats, that Kevin's interest in the farm had recently become something more urgent than family concern. He did not yet know about the geological survey that a mining company had quietly commissioned 18 months ago, the one that had found, buried beneath the rocky soil of the Briggs farm, a seam of rare earth minerals worth, conservatively, $40 million. He did not know, but he sensed the shape of the danger, the way a man who has survived enough ambushes learns to sense the forest before the shooting starts. It was on a Tuesday, 11 days into the rain, that Arthur drove Lily into town to pick up her medication from Dr. Cortez's office. He left Lily in the truck with a coloring book and walked past the post office and the hardware store and the small concrete building with the hand-painted sign that read, Millhaven Animal Clinic, Dr. Sarah Voss, DVM. He was not planning to stop. He had stopped anyway, because there was a sound coming through the clinic's propped-open side door, a low, sustained sound, somewhere between a growl and a moan, that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Not from fear, from recognition. He had heard that sound before. He had made that sound before, in a hospital bed at Walter Reed, when the sedatives wore off at 3 in the morning and the walls of the room were not walls at all, but the walls of a particular jungle clearing, 1968, and the air smelled of burning and the man next to him was screaming. Arthur pushed open the door. The dog was in a kennel in the back corner of the clinic's intake room. A German shepherd, or what remained of one, massive through the shoulders, perhaps 90 pounds even in his diminished state, with a coat that had once been the deep sable and tan of his breed and was now interrupted, on the left flank and across the muzzle, by thick ridged scars the color of old ivory. Burn scars. The kind a dog gets when it throws itself between its handler and an IED. His left eye was gone. The socket was closed, the lid fused shut by scar tissue. His right eye, amber, bright, furiously alive, was fixed on Arthur with an intensity that stopped him 3 feet from the kennel door. Dr. Sarah Voss appeared from the back hallway, a young woman with her dark hair pinned up and the kind of tired competence that comes from working too many hours for too little money in a town where most people considered their animals disposable. She saw Arthur, and her expression shifted from surprise to something more complicated. "He's not available for adoption," she said. "I'm sorry. We've made arrangements." "What kind of arrangements?" She hesitated. "His name is Rex. He was a military working dog. Served 2 deployments in Afghanistan with the 75th Rangers. His handler was killed 6 months ago, IED, same one that burned him. He was rehomed to a family in Clarksburg, but he bit the father badly enough to require surgery. The county declared him a dangerous animal." She paused. "He's scheduled for euthanasia Thursday morning." Arthur looked at the dog. Rex was watching him with that single amber eye, the low sound still coming from his chest, but quieter now. The growl had not stopped, but it had changed register. Less warning, more something else. Something Arthur could not quite name. He looked at the ruined eye socket. He thought of the jungle. He thought of Lily's silence. "I'll take him," Arthur said. I'm sorry, I don't Briggs." "Arthur Briggs. I have a farm east of town, half an acre fenced. I did 2 tours in Nam. I know what PTSD looks like." He met her eyes. "In a person or an animal. He's not dangerous. He's broken. There's a difference." Sarah Voss looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Rex, who had pressed his scarred nose against the kennel grate and was breathing in Arthur's direction with a slow, deliberate intensity. She pulled out the adoption paperwork. The first 3 days were a disaster. Rex did not eat. He circled the barn in which Arthur had set up his bedding, wearing a track in the straw with a restless, looping gait that never quite settled. He flinched from doorways. He startled at shadows. When Arthur approached with the food bowl, Rex would press himself into the corner farthest from the door, ears flat, lips drawn back, showing teeth the color of old piano keys. Not in aggression, Arthur thought, but in the posture of an animal that has learned, with perfect certainty, that good things being offered means worse things are coming. Arthur did not push. He set the bowl down at the entrance to the stall, backed away, and sat on an overturned bucket near the barn door. He sat there every morning for 2 hours. He did not speak. He did not reach out. He simply breathed in the same space as the dog, reading a paperback Western with a flashlight, being the least threatening thing he knew how to be. On the second night, the storm rolled in. It was the worst of the season so far. Thunder that felt like artillery, lightning that strobed the fields white, rain hammering the barn roof in sheets so heavy that Arthur could barely hear himself think. He came out to check the animals and found Rex in the grip of it. The dog was in the corner of the stall, shaking so violently that his tags chattered against each other, pressing himself into the angle of the walls as though he could disappear into the wood. His one good eye was wide and unseeing, fixed on something that existed only in the 6 years of his military service. Arthur recognized the look. He had seen it in mirrors. He did not call the vet. He did not go back to the house. He pulled an old horse blanket from a hook on the wall, walked to the stall, and sat down on the floor 3 feet from Rex, close enough to touch, but not touching. The thunder crashed. Rex trembled. Arthur sat. "I know," Arthur said, to no one in particular, or perhaps to both of them. "I know." He had not planned to say anything else. But the thunder kept coming, and the rain kept coming, and somehow the words came too. Not a conversation, more like thinking out loud in a room he had not expected to share. He talked about Vietnam, about the smell of the jungle after a firefight, about the way certain sounds could ambush you 30 years later with a precision that no bullet had ever managed, about waking up screaming in a farmhouse in Ohio while his wife, God rest her, held his face in both hands and said his name until he came back, about how she had died 3 years ago, quietly, of a heart attack in her garden on a Wednesday afternoon, about how his son and daughter-in-law had died 14 months ago on Route 9, about Lily's silence. He talked until his voice gave out, sometime around 3 in the morning. At some point during the second hour, Rex had stopped shaking. At some point during the third, he had moved 3 inches, then 6, then a foot. until his scarred flank was pressed against Arthur's thigh. He was still trembling, but the deep, seismic shaking had quieted to something smaller, something survivable. Arthur put his hand on the dog's back. Rex did not pull away. They sat together until the storm passed. It was not Lily's idea to approach Rex. It happened the way most important things in her life happened, quietly, without announcement, with a gravity that belied her 7 years. She simply appeared in the barn door one morning while Arthur was doing chores, in her yellow rain boots and her oversized sweater, and stood watching Rex with the calm, appraising look she gave everything she was deciding about. Rex saw her. His head came up, ears rotating forward, the ears of a working dog tracking a sound, precise as radar dishes. He did not growl. He did not bark. He went very still in the particular way that a highly trained animal goes still when it is concentrating every resource it has on a single point of interest. Lily walked across the barn floor with small, deliberate steps. Arthur held his breath and forced himself not to move, not to call out, not to reach for either of them. She stopped 2 feet from Rex, crouched down to his eye level with the natural ease of a child who has spent her whole life close to animals, and held out her hand. Palm up, the way Arthur had shown her, the way you offer yourself to a dog without demanding anything back. Rex looked at the hand for a long time. Then he leaned forward and touched his nose to her palm, just briefly, the gentlest possible acknowledgement. Then he extended his tongue and licked her fingers, once, carefully, as though the act required his full attention. Lily made a sound. Not a word. Not yet, but a sound, soft and surprised and unbearably warm. She put her other hand on the side of Rex's scarred head, so careful of the scar tissue, and he let her. He pressed into her touch. Arthur turned away and busied himself with the feed bags so that neither of them would see his face. Sheriff Dale Miller had been the law in Millhaven for 17 years, and in that time he had developed a working philosophy of power that he would never have articulated so plainly, but which governed every decision he made. The law was a tool, like a crowbar or a backhoe, and the man who held it decided what it was used for. Millhaven was a small town with a small budget and a county supervisor who was mostly interested in keeping property taxes stable and his own name out of the papers. That left a great deal of room, Dale Miller had found, for a man of ambition and practicality. The illegal sand dredging operation on the Millhaven River had been running for 4 years. Technically, it was run by a shell company called Riverside Aggregate Solutions, technically headquartered in Lexington, technically licensed in an entirely different county. In practice, Dale Miller received a cash envelope every month from a man he knew only as the contractor. And in return, he ensured that no one from the state environmental agency ever found reason to inspect the eastern bank of the river, and that his deputies never drove past the bridge on Highway 109 after midnight. The operation had removed, over 4 years, an estimated 30,000 tons of sand and gravel from the riverbed beneath the bridge supports. The bridge itself, a Tulane span built in 1974, rated for 25 tons, had been showing stress fractures in its supports for 8 months. Dale Miller had been told about this by a county road inspector named Harlan, who had subsequently been persuaded to misfile his report. The bridge was not Miller's most immediate problem. His most immediate problem was Arthur Briggs. Kevin Marsh had come to him 6 weeks ago with the geological survey and a proposition. Miller had listened carefully, asked 3 questions about the valuation, and agreed. The terms were simple. Arthur would be found to be mentally incompetent. Miller knew a judge in the county who could be persuaded and placed under guardianship. Lily would be transferred to state care as a ward of court. The farm would pass into Kevin's control by power of attorney. Kevin would sell to the mining company and split the proceeds with Miller at 30%. It was clean. It was simple. It only required that Arthur cooperate with his own destruction. Arthur Briggs, Miller had quickly discovered, was not a cooperative man. 3 weeks ago, Miller had gone to the farm on a pretext, a neighbor's complaint about the dog, fabricated. Arthur had met him at the gate with the steady, flat-eyed look of a man who had spent decades learning to read the difference between authority and theater, and who was not impressed by either. When Miller had pushed past him into the yard, using his badge and his belly and his 17 years of practiced intimidation, Arthur had said nothing, had simply watched. It was the dog that had rattled him. Rex had come around the corner of the barn at a walk. moving with the unhurried precision of a working animal on a specific errand. One eye, scarred and enormous, the fur still rough along the left shoulder. He had stopped 15 feet away and looked at Miller with an attention so focused, so quietly comprehensive, that Miller had found himself reaching for the snap on his holster before he caught himself. He had grabbed Arthur's collar instead, just to establish something, just to remind the old man who was in charge here, and shoved him back against the fence post. "You want to play it like this, Arthur? Fine. We play it like this." Arthur had said nothing. His face had not changed. Rex had not moved. But a sound had begun in his chest, deep, resonant, patient, that followed Miller all the way back to his cruiser and 30 miles down the road before he stopped hearing it. "The dog is a problem," Miller told Kevin that evening. "If we're going to do this, the dog needs to go first." Kevin had nodded and begun making calls. October gave way to November with the grudging quality of a month that does not want to leave. The rain slackened to occasional gray afternoons. The farm, under the influence of its new resident, began to feel like something more than a holding pattern between sorrows. Rex learned the farm the way he had, presumably, learned every deployment, systematically, exhaustively, with the thoroughness of an animal that understands that knowing your ground is the first condition of defending it. Within 2 weeks, he had mapped every fence line, every gap, every place where the tree cover provided concealment. He learned the schedules of the livestock, the habits of the neighbor's cats, the particular sound of Kevin's pickup truck from a mile down the road. He also learned Lily's schedule with a precision that went beyond training. By the 3rd week, he was sleeping outside her bedroom door. By the 4th, he had developed an inventory of her moods, the way her shoulders carried themselves when the nightmares had been bad, the particular quality of her silence that meant she was content versus the silence that meant she was frightened, and adjusted his behavior accordingly. On the bad mornings, he would bring her things, a stick from the yard, an old boot, once a spectacularly dead bird that Arthur had to confiscate with some difficulty. The offerings were not, Arthur thought, coincidental. They were deliberate distraction. The dog was redirecting her. It was Rex who brought him his medication when he forgot, nosing the orange bottle off the counter and carrying it, gently, with the precision of a dog trained to retrieve, to wherever Arthur was in the house. It was Rex who sat on Arthur's feet during the worst PTSD episodes, not interacting, not demanding, simply providing the anchor of his weight. In his better moments, Arthur allowed himself to think the word family. The miracle at the river happened on a Wednesday. Lily had followed Rex down to the lower pasture while Arthur was replacing boards on the north fence. The river there, a tributary of the Mill Haven, ran swift and brown in November, swollen with weeks of rain, cutting a deep channel between eroded banks. Lily had been throwing sticks for Rex, who retrieved them with enormous dignity, as though doing her a favor. Arthur heard the splash before he heard Rex's bark. He dropped the hammer and ran. By the time he got to the river bank, he had already covered the worst possibility in his mind and accepted it, had already felt the specific horror of loss. And so what he saw instead hit him with a force so different and so enormous that he stopped at the edge of the bank and simply breathed. Rex was in the river, not swimming. Exactly, more organized than swimming. He was fighting the current with the focused, dogged economy of an animal that knows exactly what it is doing and is not wasting a single movement on panic. Lily was clinging to his harness with both hands, her head above water, her eyes wide and fixed on Rex's face with an expression of absolute trust. He was not carrying her. He was pulling her, angling across the current toward the shallow eastern bank, using the geometry of the river the way a trained swimmer uses it, never fighting directly against the force, always working obliquely toward safety. It took 90 seconds. It felt like 90 years. Rex hauled himself up the shallow bank, dragging Lily with him, and she stumbled to her feet in the shallows and wrapped her arms around his neck and held on. Rex stood perfectly still, soaking and breathing hard, and pressed his face against the side of hers. Arthur scrambled down the bank. He was already reaching for her, already cataloging her condition. She was cold but breathing, no visible injuries, color coming back, when he heard it. A word, small, rough from disuse, set into the wet fur of Rex's neck. Dog. Arthur stopped moving. Lily lifted her face from Rex's fur. She looked at Arthur with eyes that were still frightened but also burning with something else, something bright and improbable, something that he had been afraid he might never see in her face again. "Dog," she said again, as though testing the sound of it, as though reacquainting herself with the mechanism that made it possible. "Good dog." Arthur sat down in the mud on the riverbank, next to his granddaughter and his dog, and he put his arms around both of them, and he did not attempt to stop or hide or explain the sound that came out of him. It was not a dignified sound, but it was real, and it was his, and after 6 years of trying to feel nothing at all, it was the most honest thing he had produced. Rex, for his part, accepted the embrace with patience, and eventually began to lick Arthur's ear, which was not helpful but was, Arthur would later think, exactly right. The storm forecast for the second week of November was the kind that the National Weather Service describes with the phrase potentially historic, which in the mountains of eastern Ohio means trees through windows and roads that become rivers, and the kind of darkness that makes you understand, in your bones, why ancient people built their fires as large as they could manage. Kevin Marsh drove through the edge of it to meet Miller at the diner in Clarksburg, 40 miles from Millhaven, where they were unlikely to be seen together. "The old man isn't going to sign anything voluntarily," Kevin said. He was on his third coffee, tapping the table with 2 fingers in a pattern that never stopped. "I thought threatening the dog would work. It hasn't. I thought threatening his living situation would work. It hasn't." He looked across the booth at Miller. "We need to take his reason for staying." Miller stirred his coffee. "You're talking about the girl. I'm talking about leverage." Kevin said the word carefully, with the specificity of a man who has already made his decision and is now working backward through the justification. "We take Lily somewhere safe. A motel, nothing rough, just long enough for Arthur to understand what cooperation looks like. Once he signs the transfer documents, she goes back. Simple." Miller considered this for a moment. What Kevin was describing was a felony, several felonies, neatly stacked. But then again, so were the 4 years of illegal river dredging and the judge he had paid and the environmental inspector he had threatened. The stack was already high. One more brick did not structurally change anything. "The storm's Thursday night," Miller said. "I'll pull Arthur in on a pretext, tax records, some compliance issue. I'll find something. Brings him into the station voluntarily. I keep him there 4 hours. That's all I need," Kevin said. He was wrong about needing 4 hours. He was wrong about several things. The tranquilizer dart hit Rex in the shoulder at 11:17 p.m., in the exact moment between 2 thunderclaps when its sound would be swallowed by the storm. Kevin had bought the drug from a man he knew in Columbus who supplied it to a livestock operation and asked no questions. He had calculated the dose based on Rex's approximate weight using a chart he had found online. Rex went down in the barn doorway. He was not supposed to get back up for 6 hours. Lily was in her room when Kevin came through the back window. She had been awake. The storm was too loud, too close, and even Rex's absence from his post outside her door had registered on her in some wordless, physical way that pulled her from sleep. She did not scream when Kevin came in. She simply looked at him with those dark, still eyes, and the look went through Kevin like a needle. He wrapped her in a blanket and carried her out through the rain to the truck. She did not struggle. She didn't make a sound. Kevin's plan was to drive south on Highway 109 to the state route, cross the bridge, and cut east to the motel in Ridgefield. 28 miles on roads he knew. He had done the drive 100 times. He did not know about the bridge. He did not know that in the past 72 hours of record rainfall, the already compromised supports beneath the Route 109 span had been grinding against each other in the current. The rebar corroded to the consistency of chalk, the concrete cracking with each surge. He did not know that at approximately 10:45 p.m., while he was parking his truck behind Arthur's barn, the eastern support column of the Millhaven River Bridge had shifted 6 inches, and the bridge deck had sagged, and then sagged further, and then, with a sound that no one was close enough to hear, had gone. The bridge was down. The road ended, in the dark and the rain, in open air above 40 feet of black, churning water. Kevin drove south on Highway 109 at 60 miles per hour with Lily bundled in the back seat, unaware of what waited for him at mile marker 11. He was 7 miles from the gap when Rex opened his eye. The drug was still in him. A thick, suffocating weight behind his eyes, a heaviness in his legs that made the simple act of standing feel like lifting the barn itself. Rex lay in the doorway of the barn and understood, without articulation, that something fundamental was wrong. He did not know words like kidnapping or timeline or dose calculation. What he knew was Lily's scent was wrong. It was moving away, and it was mixed with the scent of the man who smelled like burnt coffee and dishonesty. The man Rex had been watching for 3 weeks with the patient, meticulous attention of a dog that has been trained to recognize threats. He stood up. It took 3 attempts. His legs failed him twice, buckling as though the joints had been replaced with something unreliable. The rain hit him full in the face, and he let it, using the cold shock of it to push through the drug's weight. He stood, and his legs held, and he put his nose down to the mud and found the trail, boot prints, tire tracks, the specific chemical signature of the girl's fear through the rain. The chain on his anchor stake was veterinary grade, half-inch steel, rated for large livestock. Rex was 90 pounds of military-trained German Shepherd 3 weeks, off a near-lethal sedative dose, with a probable partial tear in his right hind hamstring from the trauma of going down. He bit through the chain in 40 seconds. He went through the gap in the fence at the south end of the pasture, the gap he had mapped in his first week at the farm, and he ran. To call it running was imprecise. It was more than that, more organized than panic, more directed than instinct. He was moving on the same cognitive equipment that had located 6 IEDs, 3 enemy combatants, and 1 missing Army Ranger in 2 years in Afghanistan. The full deployment of every sensory capacity he possessed, operating in parallel, analyzing continuously. The trail was clear enough even in the rain. The truck had gone south on the county road, toward Highway 109. He covered the 2 miles to the highway in 11 minutes, which was not fast for a working dog in condition, but was remarkable for an animal fighting a sedative and running on 3 legs and 3/4. At the highway he stopped, raised his head, and read the wind. The truck's scent was south on 109, toward the river. He ran. Behind him, in town, the situation was deteriorating. Arthur had been at the station for 2 hours, sitting across from Dale Miller in a fluorescent-lit interview room while a deputy placed thick stacks of tax records on the table one at a time, each stack representing another hour of captivity. Arthur answered the questions with the economy of a man who has been interrogated by professionals in conditions that would make Miller's fluorescent lights look like a spa, and waited, and felt the wrongness growing in him with every passing minute. The specific, electric wrongness that every soldier knows. The sensation that your position has already been compromised and the attack is already in progress, and you just haven't heard the shooting yet. His phone was in the property bag. Miller had taken it at the door. Standard procedure for all witnesses. Mr. Briggs, terribly sorry. It was Sarah Voss who found him. She had been at the station for a different reason, a hit-and-run involving a farmer's dog on Route 6, a report she had been trying to file for 3 days while Miller's deputies found reasons not to process it. She had seen Arthur's truck in the lot, and then Arthur through the interview room window, and then she had noticed the particular expression on Arthur's face. Not distress, exactly, but a compression of attention, a gathering of focus, that she had seen in him once before, during the river incident, and which she had come to understand meant that Arthur Briggs had identified a target. She walked into the interview room without knocking. "Mr. Briggs," she said, "your farm called me. There's a problem with one of the animals." The farm had not called her. But Miller, not yet knowing what the evening had set in motion, had not yet made the calculation that would have told him to keep Arthur in that room at any cost. Arthur walked out of the station with his phone and his truck keys. He was 15 miles from home when his phone showed the missed call from the camera alert on the barn door, a camera he had installed himself, quietly, 3 weeks ago, when Kevin's call stopped and he understood that the silence was not acceptance but preparation. The footage was 30 seconds long. It was enough. Arthur drove toward Highway 109 at 90 miles per hour. The bridge was gone. Rex had smelled it before he saw it. A wrongness in the air that was not rain or mud, but something older and colder. The smell of broken concrete, an exposed rebar, and the particular mineral sharpness of disturbed riverbed. He had slowed from a run to a trot to a careful walk in the last 300 meters, his nose working, his one good eye reading the darkness. He stopped at the edge of a gap and looked down. The bridge was not dramatically absent. It had not exploded or collapsed in a single cinematic moment. It had sagged and fractured and split, the near half of the deck still loosely connected to the western support, the far half gone entirely, dropped into the river below at an angle that would be invisible to any driver at speed, at night, in the rain, until the moment their wheels found nothing beneath them. 40 feet of black water, current running at 7 miles per hour from 11 days of rain. In the beam of Rex's awareness, not a calculation but a comprehension, a working dog's direct understanding of the relationship between speed and stopping distance, between the physics of a car at 60 miles per hour and the physics of a gap in the road. Kevin's truck had stopped on the other side. Rex could smell it, could smell Lily, alive, frightened, 30 meters past the gap on the intact eastern span. Kevin had gotten across before the final failure. The sound of the truck's engine was faint but continuous. Kevin had stopped when his headlights finally showed him what was in front of him, what he had missed by 30 seconds, and he was sitting very still. Rex turned his back on the gap and looked north up the highway. Headlights. Far, but coming. Moving fast. He had approximately 4 minutes. He moved to the center of the southbound lane, 200 meters north of the gap, far enough to provide stopping distance for a vehicle at highway speed, close enough that the headlights would find him immediately. He planted his feet in the asphalt, all 4 of them, with the stance of an animal that has decided on a position and intends to hold it. The first vehicle was a semi, a Peterbilt hauling aggregate in a covered trailer, probably 40 tons gross, running hard and fast in the rain on the theory that the faster you go, the less time you spend in the weather. Its headlights found Rex at 150 meters and did not slow. Horn first, a long, furious blast that Rex did not move for. Then brakes. The screaming, rubber-burning panic stop of a 40-ton vehicle discovering the limitations of its own physics. Rex did not move. The Peterbilt stopped with its front bumper 11 feet from him. The driver, a man named Carl, 52, out of Cleveland, climbed down from the cab with a flashlight and a considerable quantity of profanity, which died in his throat when he walked past Rex and pointed his flashlight south and saw the gap. He stood there for a long time. Then he got back in his truck and got on his radio and began the most important broadcast of his 17-year driving career. 3 more vehicles arrived in the next 90 seconds, a pickup, a minivan, and a passenger car, and Rex held the lane for all of them, and all of them stopped. The minivan contained a family of 4 on their way home from a Thanksgiving visit. The passenger car contained 2 college students. The pickup contained, of its own peculiar logic, 3 men who had been hunting and were now standing in the rain looking at the gap and saying quiet, shocked things to each other in the manner of men confronting the distance between the world as they assumed it to be and the world as it actually is. Behind them, a long-distance coach bus from Columbus had taken exit 11 and turned onto 109. 53 passengers. A driver named Marcus who had been making this run for 8 years and knew every inch of the road and had never once had cause to worry about it. Marcus saw the lights ahead, the stopped vehicles, the flashlights moving, the strange dark shape in the center of the lane, and put on his hazards and began to brake. He stopped 200 meters back and opened his doors and walked forward. And Carl met him and showed him the flashlight and the gap, and Marcus stood there and said nothing for a full 30 seconds. How far to the bottom? Marcus asked. 40 feet, maybe more, Carl said. Currents running hard. Marcus looked back at his bus. He had stopped in time. He had stopped because a dog had been standing in the road. He walked back to the lane center, where Rex was still holding position and crouched down in the rain in front of him. Rex looked at him with one amber eye, his chest heaving, his right leg trembling from the hamstring injury. Marcus, without entirely knowing why he was doing it, put his hand on the dog's head. Rex allowed it for exactly 3 seconds. Then he turned his head south, toward the gap and the truck and the girl. Then sirens. State Trooper Daniel Reyes had been diverted to Highway 109 by the CB radio traffic from the truck drivers. He was not one of Miller's men. He operated out of the state police barracks in Clarksburg, and his jurisdiction began where Miller's ended. And the 2 men existed in the mutual cold courtesy of officers who have never directly crossed each other, but who understand instinctively that they never will. He saw the blocked traffic at 200 meters and radioed for backup. He parked his cruiser with the lights cutting through the rain and walked forward, hand on his holster. The scene was surreal. A semi, a bus, 3 other vehicles, a dozen wet strangers standing on a highway in the dark, and in the middle of the southbound lane, a large German shepherd standing absolutely still, watching him approach. Reyes drew his weapon. Animal control is en route, his dispatcher said in his ear. ETA 12 minutes. Reyes looked at the dog. The dog looked at Reyes. Then, with a deliberateness that Reyes would describe later as the most intentional thing I have ever seen an animal do, Rex turned and looked south down the highway, then looked back at Reyes, then looked south again. He's trying to show us something, Carl said from behind him. It's a dog, Reyes said. But he followed the flashlight beam where Rex was looking, and he saw, at first just a darkness where the road should have continued, a wrongness in the geometry, and he walked closer and closer, and his flashlight found the gap and the broken rebar and the 40 feet of air and the churning black water below. Behind him, he heard people stop breathing. He stood at the edge for a long time. He was doing math, the math of speed and stopping distance, the math of a bus at 60 miles per hour discovering a 40-foot drop, the math of 53 people and what remained of them at the bottom of a rain-swollen river. He was also doing a different kind of math, the kind that has nothing to do with numbers, the kind that is simply the recognition of what has been prevented and who prevented it. He turned around. Rex was standing 10 feet behind him, watching him with that single amber eye, blood leaking in a thin stream from the hamstring that had been quietly failing for the past mile and a half. Reyes holstered his weapon. Then Rex moved, not north, not toward the roadblock, but east, toward the guardrail, toward the muddy slope below the highway embankment, toward the darkness and the brush. He moved with urgency, looking back repeatedly, the look of a dog performing the oldest herding maneuver in the species' history. Follow me, this way, come. He's going somewhere, Carl said. Reyes looked at the gap, looked at his backup unit pulling up behind the bus, looked at the dog. He followed the dog. The slope below the embankment was 15 feet of wet clay and loose shale, and Rex went down it the way water goes downhill, finding the path of least resistance, never stopping, glancing back to ensure Reyes and the two officers who had followed him were keeping up. His right leg was bad now, the movement asymmetrical, but he did not slow. Kevin Marsh had tried to turn his truck around on the narrow span after the full extent of his situation had become clear to him. The bridge gone to his south, the highway blocked behind him, and the understanding arriving slowly that the night had not gone anything like he'd planned. The truck had slid on the rain-slicked road. The passenger side had gone down the embankment in a controlled but uncontrolled way, coming to rest against the trunk of a large sycamore at the bottom of the slope, angled at 45 degrees with the driver's door pinned against the hillside. Kevin had a cut on his forehead and a cracked rib and the particular mental clarity that comes to a man when the walls close in all at once. He was still in the driver's seat, calculating escape routes that did not exist when he heard the dog. Rex hit the sycamore at a dead run, bounced off it, found the truck's passenger door, and began operating it in the manner of a dog that has opened truck doors before, which Rex had, in different contexts and for different reasons, on 17 documented occasions. The handle was not cooperative, and Rex went to the window instead, already cracked from the impact, and worked at it with his paws and his muzzle and the full investment of his attention, and Reyes arrived in time to pull the door fully open. Lily was in the back seat, still wrapped in the blanket, still silent, but with her eyes open and her arms already reaching. Reyes lifted her out. She did not fight him. Her eyes were scanning the darkness, searching, and when she found Rex, muddy and bleeding, listing to one side, but present, alive, watching her with his one amber eye, she made a sound that the trooper would not describe to reporters, but would think about for years. Rex. Rex pressed himself against her legs and stayed there while Reyes's partner dealt with Kevin Marsh and his cracked rib and the rapidly closing legal architecture of his situation. It was Reyes's partner who found the bag. It was in the truck bed, under a tarp, in a waterproof lockbox that Kevin had apparently been transporting on Miller's behalf, perhaps as collateral, perhaps as blackmail insurance, perhaps simply because Kevin had been smart enough to understand that having documentation of Miller's crimes was the most durable form of leverage available to him. Inside the box, 7 years of ledger books in Miller's handwriting, logging cash payments received from Riverside Aggregate Solutions by date and amount, photographs of Miller at the dredging site, time-stamped, a copy of the environmental inspector's original report with Miller's annotations. bank statements for an account in the Cayman Islands. Reyes stood in the rain holding the ledger and did the second kind of math again. The math of 4 years of illegal dredging, and the bridge supports that had been compromised by it, and the 53 people on the Columbus bus, and the family in the minivan, and the college students, and the hunters, and all the other vehicles that had been on Highway 109 that night or would have been in the hours before the break was discovered. All of this, he said, to no one in particular, because of this bridge. Rex, from his position pressed against Lily's legs, looked up at him with the calm, steady attention of a dog that does not require acknowledgement but accepts it without objection. Reyes's radio crackled. Clarksburg to Reyes. We have a warrant request for one Dale Miller, Millhaven County Sheriff. Can you confirm your status? Reyes looked at the ledger, looked at the dog, looked at Lily, who had her face pressed into Rex's fur and her arms around his neck, and who was murmuring something quiet and continuous into his ear that only Rex could hear. Confirmed, Reyes said into the radio. And you're going to want to bring the state environmental investigators too. The dawn came slowly, as November dawns do. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in increments of gray and then pale gold, the cloud cover thinning just enough to let the light through. The rain finally, giving way to the kind of morning that feels like permission. Arthur arrived at the scene at 4:47 a.m., having driven the last 3 miles on a county road redirected by state police roadblocks, having argued his way through 2 checkpoints with the combination of a grandfather's desperation and a veteran's command voice that brooked no procedural objection. He arrived to find his granddaughter sitting in the back of a state police SUV with a thermal blanket around her shoulders and a paper cup of hot chocolate that she had not touched, her dark eyes fixed on the ambulance where Rex was being examined by a veterinary emergency technician who had been called from Clarksburg. Arthur went to Lily first. He opened the SUV door, and she came into his arms, and they held each other in the way that people hold each other when they have come close enough to the edge to feel the air from below. And his face was in her hair, and she was saying something, saying it over and over into his jacket. Rex, she was saying. Rex, Rex, Rex. He's okay, Arthur said. His voice was not steady. He's right there. He's okay. She pulled back and looked at him with those dark, serious eyes, and then she said, Grandpa. Arthur had to put his face in his hands. He had not heard that word in 14 months. He had not known, until this moment, how much of the machinery of himself had simply been waiting for it, idling, kept running by habit and obligation and the force of not yet being done, waiting for the one thing that could tell it the reason to go on. He held her until the ambulance tech came over and said, quietly, that the dog was going to need surgery on the hamstring, that he'd lost some blood, that he was stable and awake, and, if the dog's current behavior was any indication, in a state of considerable impatience at being kept in a vehicle while his people were standing 20 feet away. They let Rex out of the ambulance. He came down the steps with the careful dignity of an animal managing a significant injury without complaint, and he walked directly to Arthur and Lily and sat down between them and pressed his whole body against their legs. His right leg was bandaged from mid-thigh to the hock. His scarred face was muddy. His one amber eye was brilliant in the early light, and he looked up at Arthur with an expression that Arthur, in defiance of the usual cautions about projecting human emotion onto animals, could not describe as anything other than satisfaction. At 5:15 a.m., Trooper Reyes arrested Kevin Marsh at the Clarksburg Regional Hospital, where he had been taken for his cracked rib. The charges, read from a list that took 90 seconds to recite, included kidnapping, criminal conspiracy, assault, and 12 counts of evidence suppression. At 6:40 a.m., 3 state police vehicles pulled up outside the Millhaven County Sheriff's Station. Dale Miller, who had spent the night in his office waiting for a call from Kevin that never came and watching the situation deteriorate through a police scanner with the quality of a man watching his own house burn, came out the front door before they could come in. He was in full uniform. He was not armed. There was a brief discussion about what the charges were, and who had produced the ledgers, and whether Miller wanted to call an attorney before saying anything. Miller did not call an attorney. He looked at the state police lieutenant, and then, in a moment that the lieutenant would describe as one of the stranger things he had witnessed in 22 years of law enforcement, Miller asked, "Is the dog all right?" The lieutenant considered this. "The dog is fine," he said. Miller nodded. He put his hands out for the cuffs. At 6:15 in the morning, As Miller was being put in the back of the cruiser, and a crowd of Millhaven residents who had gathered in the parking lot of the diner across the street were watching in the mixed silence of people processing the revision of 17 years of assumed reality. Trooper Reyes walked over to where Arthur and Lily and Rex were standing by Arthur's truck. He looked at Rex for a moment. Rex looked back at him with the calm, comprehensive attention that had become familiar. Reyes straightened to his full height, squared his shoulders, and rendered a parade ground salute to a 90-pound German shepherd with one eye and a bandaged leg. Arthur said nothing. He thought, with the distant, practical clarity of a man who has learned to live in the moment rather than the abstraction, that he needed to call Sarah Voss about the surgery. He thought that the north fence still needed 3 boards. He thought that in a few hours it would be fully light, and the farm would be there, and Lily would be there, and Rex would be there. He put his hand on Rex's head. Rex leaned into the touch and made a sound that was not a growl and not a whimper and was, in some way that Arthur could not have explained to anyone, an answer. The following months came and went with the particular quality of time that has been reclaimed. The surgery on Rex's hamstring was successful. He would always carry the leg slightly, always favor the right side on cold mornings, but the limp became, to those who knew him, simply another part of the topography of a life fully lived. Sarah Voss drove out to the farm twice a week for the physical therapy and stayed, often, for dinner, and her laughter in the kitchen became the sound that Arthur associated, later, with the moment the house stopped being a place where people waited and started being a place where people lived. Lily's speech came back not all at once, but in the manner of a river finding its old course, tentatively at first, then with more confidence, then with the full, unself-conscious ease of a child who has remembered that language is not a risk but a gift. She began school in January. Her teacher called Arthur in February to tell him that Lily had written a story for a class assignment about a dog who had stood in the middle of a road in a rainstorm and stopped a disaster, and that the story had made the teacher cry. "It's a true story," Arthur said. "I know," the teacher said. The mining company's exploratory license was denied by the State Environmental Board in March, pending a full investigation of the River 109 bridge failure and the illegal dredging operation. The investigation was, by all accounts, thorough. Kevin was sentenced to 12 years. Miller received 22, the additional decade a consequence of the charges related to the bridge, criminal negligence, failure to report known infrastructure failure, conspiracy resulting in endangerment of human life. The sentencing judge had read all 7 years of the ledgers before passing judgment. She did not say much at sentencing beyond what was legally required, but she paused before the final charge was read and said, "I want the record to reflect that the exposure of these crimes and the prevention of what the state's engineering expert has testified could have been the most lethal infrastructure failure in this county's history, is attributable to the actions of a single animal acting from loyalty alone. I find that worth noting. The record reflected it. On a Saturday morning in May, when the pasture was green and the river was running low and clear in the way it only runs in late spring before the summer heat thickens it, Lily ran across the grass with her arms out, and Rex ran to meet her with the lopsided, joyful gait of a dog that has decided the bad leg is not going to get in the way of anything that matters. They collided in the middle of the field and went down together in a heap, rolling, and Lily's laughter carried all the way to the porch where Arthur sat in the old wooden chair with his coffee, watching. He was not thinking about Vietnam. He was not thinking about the accident on Route 9. He was not thinking about Kevin or Miller or the bridge or the night of the rain. He was thinking that the coffee was good, and the morning was good, and that across the field, tangled in the grass with a 7-year-old girl who had not spoken for 14 months and who was now, apparently, delivering a detailed monologue to a dog about the specific failings of a frog she had found in the garden, was a 90-pound German shepherd with one eye and a bad leg and a history that would have broken anything less determined than what he was. Arthur raised his coffee cup. Rex, from across the field, looked up at him with that single amber eye, then went back to the frog commentary. Arthur drank his coffee and let the morning be what it was, ordinary, unheroic, alive. Every last inch of it. In the end, what Rex understood, what he had always understood, in the simple, unmediated way of a creature that does not complicate the things it loves, was that loyalty is not a decision. It is not a calculation. It is not something you summon in a moment of crisis and then put away when the crisis passes. It is a condition of being as constant and unremarkable as breathing, until the moment it is asked to become everything. He had been broken and discarded and nearly extinguished. He had been given, at the last possible moment, a man and a child who needed him as much as he needed them. He had stood in the road. That was all. That was everything.